Welcome to meeting number 81 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members will be attending in person in the room as well as remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Before speaking, please do wait until I recognize you by name. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our very best to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informed by the kind clerk that the committee has done their connection tests in advance of our meeting. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motions adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022, and Tuesday, May 30th, 2023, the committee resumes its study of the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border and implications for peace and security. So we are very, very grateful to have for the first hour with us today our new ambassador to Ukraine, Her Excellency Natalka Kamach. We're terribly sorry about the connectivity or the headphone challenge you had last time, so we're very, very much looking forward to your appearance today, Madam Ambassador. So, Madam Ambassador, you will have, did you want 5 minutes, 10 minutes for your opening remarks?
I can do it in 5 minutes.
Great. So we will commence with your opening remarks, after which we will open it to questions from the members. If you could just, if you do see this telephone up, that means we're asking that you wrap up your remarks as soon as possible. And that applies not only to your opening remarks, but also to the questions posed by the members as well. So that all having been said, welcome, and the floor is yours, Madam Ambassador.
Okay. Chers membres du comité,
Committee members, thank you for having given me the opportunity to give you an update on the situation in Ukraine and Kyiv. I arrived in the middle of August, and I was able to directly observe the determination of the Ukrainian people in opposing the brutal aggression of Russia. I was assigned here in the past when the country was divided, but that's not what I'm seeing here now. The country is more united than ever. Ukrainians have clearly entered into a post-colonial era where they want a clear separation from Russia, and they also wish for reconciliation for the Soviet errors of the past, such as the recognition of Holodomor and forced Russification. They want to be modern and European, preserve their democratic society and free press, and work for a fairer society.
Mistake, Russia is threatened by this, and this is a war against Ukrainian identity. Russia purposefully targets civilians. Just 1 month ago, Russia killed 59 civilians in one strike on a little village of Roza, which has a total population of only 330 people. Russia steals people. An estimated 1.6 million have been forcibly displaced to Russia. Almost 20,000 of these are children. This is a war with global impact as Russia weaponizes food and winter. Ukraine is bracing for an even more challenging winter as Russia is yet again targeting critical energy infrastructure while damage from last year has not been fully rebuilt. Since February 2022, Russia stole 6 million tons of Ukrainian wheat and sold it themselves, worth $1 billion, destroyed 280,000 tons of grain and 27 ports, and actively blockades Ukrainian ships. Ukraine's counteroffensive grinds on at a huge cost of life. Notwithstanding recent gains in the east and south, there's a growing realization that it will be a longer war than hoped. Ukrainians have full confidence that with President Zelensky's leadership, they can win, but they need military support, and in particular, air defense and ammunition. Ultimately, this is a test of resolve. Ukraine's top priority is winning this war on the battlefield, but also in countering disinformation. This is why Ukraine deeply appreciates Canada being among the first countries to launch negotiations for long-term security commitments, including multi-year funding. Les estimations indiquent qu'il faudra au moins
Estimates are that it will require at least $420 billion to rebuild damages from war, and we're asking to find creative ways to use seized Russian assets. It's an opportunity for Canada to create joint businesses with Ukrainian partnerships to rebuild the country. This will benefit Ukraine, Canada, and other countries in the fields of food, IT, and energy.
All Canadians. Russia's deliberate policies to erase the identity of Crimean Tatars. As an Indigenous people of Ukraine, it is particularly appalling. Russia denies their status as an Indigenous autonomous nation and reduces them to a minority. Since 2014, approximately 200 of the 300 political prisoners in Crimea have been Crimean Tatars, and Russia's conscription has focused on minority populations in Russia-occupied territories, including Crimea. At a time when Canada is pursuing truth and reconciliation domestically, it is important that Canada stand up for the protection of Indigenous peoples around the world. The longer this war drags on, the higher the cost to the world. Ukraine is resolved to defeat Russia and not settle. They are seeking full restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They want the return of political prisoners of war and the taken children, and are demanding the world to help achieve accountability for Russia's crimes. Rest assured that the Canadian Embassy team is now fully operational, is standing up to the challenge, and will continue to stand along Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. We now turn to the members, and the first member up is MP Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador, for appearing in front of us today. I wish you well in your new post. You mentioned in your opening comments that Ukraine needs more military aid, in particular air defense and ammunition. General Wayne Eyre earlier, about a month ago, in front of the Defense Committee, testified that the federal government has yet to reach a deal to increase output of artillery rounds, particularly the most used ammunition, which is the 155 millimeter ammunition used by Canada's M777 howitzers. Can you tell us if there is an imminent plan to increase that ammunition production in Canada in order to assist Ukraine in its war efforts?
Mr. Chairperson, I am actually not aware of the details of the commitment that Canada has made in terms of the production of ammunition to Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Minister, the Minister of National Defense reaffirmed that, quote, Canada will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, end quote. At what point would Canada consider the goals that have informed its support for Ukraine to have been fulfilled?
Mr. Chairman, from what I understand, as Prime Minister had indicated clearly in the visit from the President Zelensky in Canada, is that Canada will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And from my understanding, that we'll stand with Ukraine until full territorial and sovereignty is regained, and that is the 91 borders. That is my understanding.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that. In other words, the objective of the Government of Canada's support for Ukraine is to see Ukraine return to its pre-2014 boundaries, its 1991 boundaries, as you just mentioned. To that end, it looks like that objective is stalling. Ukraine's counteroffensive, which was launched in June of this year, has made virtually no gains, and its effect at this point is inconclusive. So what actions is the Government of Canada taking to further it meeting its objective, seeing that's not currently moving in the right direction?
Mr. Chairperson, from the information that I am receiving from our defense attaché and other sources, including the newly appointed Minister of Defense here, our understanding that the gains, we are seeing gains, including countering some of the recent sort of forward motions of Russia in towns like Advichka. I cannot find the exact title, but I mean, I think it's around Bakhmut and south of Robotine. And Russia was not successful to capture it in Adviivka and Vuhledar, but Ukraine, although it's slow, are making gains south and east. Part of the challenge is that as they make gains, Russia is adding more and more minefields, adding to that land. That's our understanding.
Does the government have are there any discussions going on in the government to provide more military support for Ukraine, seeing that that's been the big request of President Zelensky in his recent overseas trip?
Mr. Chairman, I can find the information shortly, but we have, again, in that same visit that the president came to Ukraine, we have made additional commitments to the military support. So one is the critical, where we are evolving the critical training for Operations Unifier. We are providing support in terms of like adding to other donors as well, support to the F-16 program, which I understand begins in January 2024. We are also supporting support to cybersecurity needs. And I understand that there were armored vehicle commitment, and I cannot find the exact source, but I believe it's $650 million Canadian dollars worth of armored vehicles that will be beginning production in London, Ontario. Those are some of the things that run off the base. I could get more if you would like
Thank
more
you,
information.
I just have two other quick questions. You mentioned in your opening statement that some 20,000 Ukrainian children have been taken out of Ukraine into Russia. My first question is, does the government assess the abduction of those 20,000 children as war crimes under international humanitarian law?
Mr. Chairperson, I'm not an expert in this area, but what I've been told, and I sit on the peace formula working groups related to this, and my understanding is that that they are making a case that this already, so I believe that this has already been found to be a war criminal by Ms.
I'm short on time, so I just want to ask you a second quick question.
Yes.
Quick question, just on the civilian casualties. You mentioned civilian casualties. There have been roughly 27,500 civilian casualties in Ukraine as reported by reputable sources. Does the government assess that all of those are war crimes?
So to answer your first question, detained children have been, I believe, considered a war crime, and there's an arrest warrant for Mr. Putin. I think that there is a current case being built up in terms of the civilians actively right now, including the ICC, which Canada supports.
Thank you. We next go to Dr. Fry. Dr. Fry, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Ambassador, and welcome. I'm sorry about the little problem with your mic last time. We would have loved to hear from you. Thank you for coming. I think for many of us, we are committed, as we well know, the Prime Minister said, for as long as it takes, whatever it takes. However, Canada is not the most armed nation in the world. We don't have the largest army. We're not have a lot of capacity to send as many arms as, say, the U.S. may have. However, we've been sending arms, economic aid, training, humanitarian aid, anything that we can do, Canada has been there. However, it would seem to people like me who have lived through it that there's a fear for many of us at Ukraine because of what's happening in Gaza right now and on the other areas of conflict around the world, that Ukraine may eventually end up to be another Vietnam, which would be an absolute horrifying thought. I think we all saw that last fall, Ukraine had moved forward and had done a great deal of harm to Russia and taken some things. But in the end, we can still say that right now, there are only about 500 square miles of recaptured Ukrainian territory that has happened. And I hear what you say that Ukraine is looking for, and I think that's really important. What do you see as a big problem? One of the things we have been counting on is sanctions. I am told that, in fact, Kazakhstan has allowed itself to become a hub for arms, for food, for trade, and for all sorts of things coming from Iran and India and China and other areas in bypassing Europe's sanctions. Is that going to have an impact on Ukraine's ability to move forward? Is that a real problem? Are we concerned about that? Secondly, I wanted to ask, what is going to happen if we don't hurry and actually okay as a parliament this trade deal that we're trying to do with Ukraine? Because that's part of the economic strength that Ukraine is trying to muster for itself. What are the impacts if that doesn't happen? Because it's being stalled, as we well know, by the Conservatives. So can you answer me those two questions, please? Thank you.
Dear Mr. Chairperson, yes, we often have that noted to us in various meetings in terms of the concerns that about the sanctions and working around them. But we also understand that they are making a difference and they are making it a little bit more challenging, definitely more challenging for Russia. And I have also heard the Kazakhstan situation. I think that Ukraine is also countering a lot of that by starting to make their own productions and meeting the needs. But I think that the continued efforts with sanctions is definitely making a difference, and it's the right call. I'm not sure I'm following the second question, so apologies. If it's in terms of positioning Canada to be able to contribute in trade, then I know that there's two large conferences that I'll be participating in the next 2 weeks. One is on Warsaw in terms of rebuilding energy, and the second one is in Toronto, and it's a broader to start implementing some of the CUFTA commitments and trying to attract Canadian investors and businesses to work with Ukrainians, and it'll have participation, from what I understand, of both Ukrainians and Canadian businesses, and see where there might be some possible areas.
There is a trade agreement that's pending right now with Ukraine, and that has to go through Parliament, and it's being stalled right now. And this would seem to be a very negative thing to do, given Ukraine's needs, given winter coming, given the lack of food, given the lack of fuel, given all of the kinds of things. It would be really important for Ukraine to get that economic independence of having a trade deal. That was what I wondered. Did you know what the impact of that would be? With regard to the issue of the children, I know that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Parliamentary Assembly have agreed that the abduction of these children constitutes a war crime. What is the problem if Putin, is there a problem if Putin cannot leave his country because he's wanted outside of its borders for war crimes? Is that going to create a negative impact for Russia? Or does it matter?
Mr. Chairman, what we have seen is that Mr. Putin has not participated in some of the meetings and sent a replacement delegate, and it is believed that it's because of the arrest warrant that's out in his name. So we have seen that in South Africa, for example. So I think that Ukrainians do believe that it is making a difference in terms of his participation.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I have one more question. Are you hopeful, Ambassador, that we are able to push back and to regain everything, including Crimea? What is needed to do that?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that the country is incredibly positive and united and are very grateful to all this global support and hope to continue that pressure. As we saw in the various summit meetings, the last one being in Malta to discuss the peace formula, we're seeing an increase of interest. So this last meeting in Malta had 66 countries attending and offering to participate in the discussions of the 10-point peace plan. So I think that, yes, I think that there is overall hope that they will be successful. I think what is the concern is how long is it going to take and what is it going to take?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Your Excellence, for being here today. I wish you best of luck with your new mandate. As my colleagues, I was very disappointed with the situation that happened during your first appearance. I have to say that I'm probably the only one who was at an advantage by this technical issue because, as you know, at that time I was in Berlin and I was meeting with somebody that you know, and so I did have the opportunity, to speak with you today, and I'm very pleased about that. In your opening statements, you said that the Ukrainians realized it would be a longer war than they had hoped. So during the visit of President Zelensky in Ottawa, the government announced supplementary aid of $150 million over a 3-year period, allowing to provide 50 armed vehicles and as well as emergency vehicles. Why over 3 years? Is it because the Canadian government believes that this can last up to 3 years?
Estimated that it's going to take a little bit longer to win. In part, again, this is just what I'm hearing from the Ukrainians, that they believe that Mr. Putin is holding out to see what the American elections will do, and he's just kind of, Mr. Putin is having a protracted war and just has to kind of keep steady pressure, and it's on the Ukrainian side to be able to make that progress in terms of the countermeasure, both in the east but also down in the Black Sea, and we are seeing some advances in the Black Sea as well.
On sait que l'Ukraine a besoin, bien sûr, de.
So yes, I understand that Ukraine needs these armored vehicles, but they especially need munitions. At the end of September, a general recognized that the rhythm of production of Canada, 3,155 millimeter why not having increased the rhythm of production to meet the needs of the Ukrainian army?
Mr. Chairman, this is beyond my my understanding of how that works in Canada, but I do understand from colleagues and the defense attaché, I've heard him say that it's in part it's not just Canada, it's throughout the Western world of being able to keep up with production appears to be a bit of a challenge, and countries are needing to figure out collectively and together and independently how they can increase some of the production, but it seems to be a global issue.
Dans une entrevue publiée
On October 30th in the Times Magazine, the Ukrainian president said that he was concerned about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, that the impact this would have on the world geopolitical stage, and he was fearing that the Ukrainian conflict might be forgotten by the international community, given the importance or the scale of importance given to this Middle Eastern conflict. What is your opinion on this? And do you think that this conflict, this new conflict that is unfolding between Azerbaijan and Armenia is also encouraging the Russian interests in order to take people's attention away from what's happening in Ukraine?
Mr. Chairman, and indeed, it is something that we're hearing the Ukrainians are absolutely concerned about. That, but we're also hearing, and I hear that too, that key international partners indicate the situation in Israel will not affect their steadfast support for Ukraine, including the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who assured President Zelensky that U.S. will continue to provide Ukraine with necessary support without interruption. As well as the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. can provide aid to both Ukraine and Israel. As well as the European Commission has stated situation in Israel will not lead to decreased support to Ukraine. So these are the same types of statements that we're hearing from Canada. They seem to be well aligned.
Excellence, votre prédécesseur avait expliqué dans les...
Your predecessor explained last April that the embassy was open, but was operating on a limited basis. You yourself was saying that you hope that you'd have your complete team between now and October. Where are we at with that?
Mr. Chairperson, we had an almost entirely replacement of the entire team this past summer. So we now have a team of 22 Canadian-based staff and 50 locally engaged staff present. And we are resuming a lot of our work. We're still waiting on some of our equipment that needs to be replaced, but we are operating, I believe, in sort of 90% full mode. And I believe that within a month or so, we'll be able to be back to where we were pre-war in our services, I mean.
Excellence, depuis le début du conflit, la situation sécuritaire...
Since the beginning of the conflict, we've seen the volatility of the situation, but representatives of elected people have gone to Kyiv in our G7. Japan and Canada are the only ones who have not sent a parliamentary delegation to Ukraine. The Prime Minister, ministers, officers of the armed forces go, but there are individual visits, such as done by our colleague Mrs. McPherson, by assuming themselves, by bearing themselves the cost of the visit. Is this because the embassy is not able to support the visit of a parliamentary delegation from Canada?
Mr. Chairman, we will be in position to be able to host delegations here, and that could be as early as winter.
Thank you. We now go to MP McPherson. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being with us today, Your Excellency. It's nice to see you, and congratulations on your new position. Just to follow up on what my colleague Mr. Bergeron has said, it would be very important, I think, for this committee to visit Ukraine, to be able to go to Kyiv. I know what I saw when I was there in March has fundamentally strengthened my resolve to support Ukraine, which was already an extraordinarily strong resolve. We've talked a little bit about the fact that Ukraine requires military support. We also know there are some limitations on that military support that Canada can provide. We are, as Madam Fry said, not a well-equipped military. But what we are known for is demining efforts, and we do know that right now Ukraine is one of the most mined countries in the world. We do know that it is huge. It is a huge deterrence to making progress, particularly in South Ukraine, in the southern parts of Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about the support that Canada has provided? And then I think even more, what more support could Canada provide with regards to demining, because we do have this expertise and this is something that Canada could be increasing our support for?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I just got it. Yes, Canada is leading on both military and humanitarian demining, and we are making a lot of contributions here. Excuse me, I'm just trying to find the exact I'd be happy to send the details. They're just not at my fingertips. I did just visit 2 days ago one of the training sites near Lviv. I can't provide the exact detail with humanitarian demining, and saw in action where so far 160 Ukrainians have been trained for humanitarian demining. And so they already had, I think, 8 classes of 30 people each. And that's just one example. As the military, Canadian military, have also been providing a lot of support in terms of operational demining, and as well as a lot of equipment. But I will need to be able to find that information and send that to you directly, separately, as I don't seem to have to find it on my.
Thank you.
Currently,
that would be useful. When I was in Kyiv in March, I did meet with a group of teenagers who were actually going out with very, very rudimentary equipment to demine fields, so that people could go back into communities like Irpin and Bucha. So for me, this seems like something that would align perfectly with Canada's interest in that. To be able to provide those supports, I think, is important. Another key support I think we want to be able to see is support for the ICC and ICJ investigations. In the International Human Rights Committee, which I'm also a member, we are looking at the stealing and the taking of 20,000 Ukrainian children. It is obviously horrific. Canada has supported that investigation, but there is obviously a long road ahead in terms of making sure that the tools are available to identify and to build that case. Is Canada involved in that at all?
Mr. Chairperson, we actually are. The ICC has just recently opened up a field office. We are present, and in fact, when I went to hear the prosecutor, the general prosecutor. Han, yes, that's speak. He made a mention of thank you to Canada specifically. We have increased the number to 10 recently of Canadian personnel deployed here, and as well as providing $2 million to the ICC Trust Fund to increase courts' capacity to investigate criminal activities, including sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children.
Thank you. And I do want to just, of course, note that Ukraine and Russia are not signatories to the Rome Statute, as are other regions that are currently at war. And so Canada should be applying the rule of law equally to all regions. One other concerning thing that we've seen recently that has come out of Russia is Putin pulling back on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. How concerned are you with that? What is Canada's position on that, please?
Yes, I think, Mr. Chairperson, it is a concern, and I think that from what I understand, that we've seen that there's evidence of that they have started performing some tests as well. I'd be able to provide the information that I have from here, but it is concerning. I agree.
Can you tell me, when you say that they've started to do the test, from your opinion, and I know this is just asking for an opinion, but could you tell me whether you think that this is, saber rattling, if this is just meant to be deterrent, meant to be a threat, or how valid do you think that threat is at this point?
Mr. Chairperson, I understand that Russia's parliament completed the legislative process of de-ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by unanimous vote in the upper chamber of parliament, and the president degree is expected soon to complete the unusual step of de-ratification. So while Russia insists that it is not withdrawing from the treaty, we are seeing that that there are reports of Russian nuclear training exercise, and Canada is monitoring the situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now move into the second round. First up is MP Chung. You have 5 minutes for this round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since a member on this committee made a partisan comment about Conservative support for Ukraine, I'd like to clarify the record on Conservative support for Ukraine. Mr. Chair, it was a Conservative government on December 2nd, 1991, that was the first nation amongst Western nations to recognize Ukraine's independence. It was a Conservative government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper that negotiated the current Canada-Ukraine free trade deal that is currently in place. It was the same Conservative government that initiated Operation Unifier, that I would note that the opposition voted against at the time in funding, Operation Unifier being critical in ensuring that Ukraine's military was prepared for the Russian invasion. In fact, many people were surprised by how Ukraine fought back when Russia began its invasion in February of last year, and many people have attributed the strength of Ukraine's armed forces to that Operation Unifier that was initiated under Conservative government. It was the same Conservative government, I would remind members of this committee, that changed the G8 to the G7. It was under the leadership of Prime Minister Harper that Russia was expelled from the G8 for its behavior and for its belligerence toward Ukraine, which is why we now have the G7 rather than the G8. It was the same Prime Minister, I would remind members of this committee, who at the G20 told President Putin directly to his face, as captured on camera, that, quote, "You need to get out of Ukraine," end quote, at the G20 summit in Australia. And we have continued on with that strong support for Ukraine as the country's official opposition. We, in this parliament, made numerous calls on the government in 2021 and early 2022 to provide lethal military equipment to Ukraine, a call for action that the government refused to uphold. In fact, on January 27th, 2022, less than a month before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when it was clear to all that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, and when our closest military allies were providing lethal military aid, Prime Minister Trudeau refused and said, quote, "The solution to this tension should be diplomatic," end quote. Then several weeks later, I note to members of this committee, he flip-flopped, and in a quiet cabinet decision taken 10 days before the invasion began on February 24th, on February 14th announced that the government was willing to provide lethal aid. And I would add, Mr. Chair, that was too little, too late to preempt the invasion. And in all of these initiatives, it was Conservatives who led in the support for Ukraine. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that clarifies the record for members of this committee about Conservative support for Ukraine. And I cede the floor back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. You still have a minute and a half remaining. Mr. Abeltave, did you want to take it?
Sure. Michael, you're done? Okay. Thank you, Chair. Your Excellency, I have a question, a couple of questions for you. The position of the international community as far as of the Russian invasion to Ukraine hasn't been all the same. Do you believe that some of those positions been influenced by the economic reasons? And if you can give an example, would be good. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, yes, we are seeing that the disinformation is making a difference in terms of the global South countries, and to have, for example, Brazil. Another example is the recent Slovak election, where they have declared that they are no longer going to be providing military assistance, but they will continue humanitarian assistance. But they had also declared that they are supportive of the European Union accession of Ukraine as well.
Thank you. Could Canada play a different role, a bigger role, in order to change that narrative or change that position somehow to allow more support for Ukraine from the larger international community members?
Mr. Chair, from what I have seen, I think that having more diplomatic relations with the global south is making a difference. We're seeing that in the working groups for the peace formula. We are now, while we have a tight G7 and European group here, we're now expanding that to include others. And just last week, I met with the new Turkish ambassador, and that went very well. And I've met with the Brazilian ambassador. So I here also on the ground am trying to expand on in terms of who I'm meeting and engaging and encouraging their participation in the various working groups, and also to be able to get a better understanding of what are they thinking and what are their concerns or hesitations.
Thank you. Food security, energy security.
I'm afraid you're out of time, Mr. Abeltaif. So next we go to MP Al Gabra. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Ambassador. Congratulations on your new assignment, and let me express my gratitude to you and your colleagues at the Embassy in Ukraine for your public service under difficult circumstances. And I'm glad to see you back, able to brief us in front of this committee. I want to build on the previous question about the reports that we're hearing coming out of Europe and the apparent weakening of collective resolve. Can you give this committee your assessment of European resolve towards supporting Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that, from what I understand, on November 8th, there will be a European Commission report that will speak to the 7 points in terms of the European integration and some of the reforms. In my conversations with the European ambassador, all sense is that it's going well, and they're feeling that there is progress, and that it'll likely be continued progress when working with Ukraine. So I think that there is large support, but we'll know more after November 8th.
And to carry on this narrative, there is a risk that has been talked about regularly out there, which is the fatigue with the ongoing war on Ukraine. The fact that public opinion is paying attention to other international conflicts, other domestic issues. This is a risk that President Zelensky has highlighted. This is a risk that the government of Canada needs to be aware of. Us as parliamentarians, especially in this committee, need to address. So what is your advice to us as parliamentarians, as member of this committee, to address this risk, and how can you help us re-emphasize the point of why it is so important for Canada that Ukraine is victorious?
Mr. Chairperson, I think in general and overall, there's agreement that this war is a global war, and it is about the principles that we need to be able to maintain. And we're starting to see that divide between the rule-based world and the non-rule-based world, or the BRICS, as so they call them. So I think that the rule-based order is really critical. Also, some of that we had spoken in terms of food security and energy security are issues that are going to affect all of the world, and they are not going to disappear if Ukraine is defeated. In fact, they will increase, is the sense here.
Your Excellency, can you also talk about the role of Russia in spreading misinformation online, particularly online? It's not just only online, and how that is having an impact on that public perception in the West, including here in Canada, and what is your advice to us as MPs to address this challenge?
Mr. Chairman, I agree that that is probably the more dangerous part of the war is the disinformation, the malinformation that's out there and that's being created. It is taking a partial truth and making it unclear so that the public no longer knows if it's true or false. And there's a couple of examples there. And there's a lot to be done in this area. It's not my expertise, but I agree that this is something that we do need to do. Now, GAC has a rapid response mechanism, Canada, that continues to monitor and report on Russia's attempt to manipulate the information environment and spread. And I think it's been very well received by the Canadian public, and we're in close coordination with allies and like-minded partners to counter Russian malign influence campaigns.
I think I might be running out of time, Your Excellency. So one final question to you is, and I will emphasize this because it was in my previous questions, what is your advice to us as members of this committee, as we are doing what we can to remind Canadians of the importance of this battle and why our resolve is critical at this moment?
Mr. Chairman, I would say continue to support the fight and the war with supplies for the military training, and I think it's a good opportunity now to consider investing in Ukraine as well, and in particular certain areas that might align very well with Canadian sectors, and whether that's energy, critical infrastructure, nuclear power, for example, railway. There's a lot of interest, and I think it would align very well with Canadian strengths as well. Critical minerals is another one that's been mentioned.
Thank you. We now go to MP Bergeron. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to come back to the importance for Canada eventually to send to Kyiv, even though we haven't done this yet, but to send to Kyiv a parliamentary delegation. Canada says that it is Ukraine's closest ally, but yet we have not set foot there. And despite security issues for parliamentarians throughout, other people have gone there. I'd like to come back to the embassy, the operations of the embassy, and I know that perhaps the request is not as pressing today, but will we undertake the analysis of visa requests in Kyiv rather than forcing Ukrainians to have to leave their country to make a visa request to come to Canada?
Mr. Chairman, yes, visas seem to be continue to be a critical issue here. Currently, the visa regime is still done outside of Ukraine, so in London and in Poland at this time, until we can return a lot of the computer infrastructure required for secure information. So that is still an issue here in Ukraine, in Kyiv, the embassy in Kyiv, sorry.
Mais je comprends, Excellence, que l'objectif...
So I understand that the objective is to bring back the visa operations to Kyiv.
It's taking some time to be able to return the servers required to be able to do that.
On peut espérer
which
que...
is in...
Je m'excuse.
Sorry, Your Excellency. You'll be able to continue because I am going to continue in the same line of questioning. What's the timeline for visa applications to be treated and dealt with in Kyiv?
Mr. Chairman, from what I understand, it's everything. It could be days to a couple of weeks. It's not. We're not talking months. It's a shorter term that we should be able to increase that service here within Kyiv itself.
Excellence, vous savez que lors de la visite...
your time is over.
It's over. Bon,
Yes.
tant pis.
Thank you. For the final 2.5 minutes, we go to MP McPherson. It's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, Your Excellency. I also have a question about the embassy. So we know earlier in this war, there was reports that Russia was going to invade, and that the embassy staff were sort of left to the Ukrainian embassy staff were left to their own devices. We know that this is based on a decision, I think it was put in place by Stephen Harper in 2014 in Afghanistan, but we still have not seen the embassies change the fact that there is duty of care for our staff who are not from Canada. We saw that the Canadian staff were actually told not to tell the Ukrainian staff that they were at risk. This is appalling, and I'm wondering whether or not you can update us on if this has been changed to make sure that our local staff in embassies across the world, but particularly in war countries that are experiencing war, are being protected.
Mr. Chairman, my duty of care applies to all the Canadian-based staff. Currently, I have a hard cap of 25, but also all LES, locally engaged staff, while they're at work. So the current situation is still the same. However, we do share information very openly. I have with them monthly meetings where we talk about a lot of these issues and questions very regularly, and I'm as open and transparent as I can in terms of the staff of what I can and cannot do. But I think first and foremost is making sure that they have the information of what is happening and what's happening in Ukraine.
And I would just like to articulate that from my perspective, not having duty of care for all staff of the Canadian Embassy is appalling, and so I would certainly like to see that be changed. Very last question for you, and just to get some insight, we know that Prigozhin has been killed. What is the impacts on the Wagner Group? How does that change the math or the calculations, I guess, with regards to the Wagner Group?
Mr. Chairman, from what I understand, the Canada is so the Wagner Group is still present under new leadership, and then there's other groups as well that are there. So they're still part of it, but it's really not affecting the war any differently or less than it has been so far.
Thank you very much.
So at this point, Madam Ambassador, allow me to thank you on behalf of all members of this committee. We're very, very grateful that you made yourself available, and we look forward to hearing from you again, hopefully very, very soon. So that having been said, I'm just going to end the meeting for about approximately 4 or 5 minutes. We have more witnesses lined up for the second hour. So I will suspend for approximately 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We will now resume our meeting and the study of the situation at the Russia-Ukraine border and implications for peace and security. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. First, we have from the United Nations World Food Programme, we have Mr. Matthew Hollingworth, who regrettably had some challenges last time, but we're grateful that you could make it back. Mr. Hollingworth is the World Food Programme representative and country director for Ukraine. From the Canadian Agri-Trade Alliance, we're grateful to have Mr. Michael Harvey with us. Mr. Harvey is the executive director of the Canadian Agri-Trade Alliance. And lastly, we're grateful to have two witnesses from the Canadian Canola Growers Association. We're grateful to have Dave Carey, who's the Vice President of Government and Industry Relations, as well as Ms. Gail McLaughlin, who is the Manager of Government and Industry Relations. So you will each be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks. I understand, Ms. McLaughlin and Mr. Carey, you're going to share the 5 minutes. So that's for opening remarks, and then we have questions from the members. If it's getting very close to the time that the members have available to them, I will hold this up, and that means please do try to wrap it up as soon as possible. So we will start with Mr. Hollingworth. Mr. Hollingworth, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And on behalf of the United Nations World Food Programme in Ukraine, I'm honored to sit before the committee today. As you know, the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine now has persisted for more than 20 months. And every day, we bear witness to the enormous human suffering, indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and critical infrastructure, causing destruction and waves of displacement in the north and northeast and east of this country. Over the past months, intensifying conflict in all frontline communities in the Eastern Crescent from Kharkivska to Khersonska has made it increasingly challenging to provide essential humanitarian assistance where it's most urgently needed. And in the south, attacks on the port and grain infrastructure following the termination of the Black Sea Initiative last July have created additional hurdles to Ukraine's agricultural exports. And as of this week, the Office for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented 29 such infrastructure attacks. These attacks have targeted grain terminals, warehouses, port infrastructure, industrial equipment, and administrative buildings in direct violation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2417, which condemns the use of hunger as a weapon of war. But moreover, these attacks have severely impacted the livelihoods of Ukrainian farmers and all people involved in food systems in the country, many of whom are women, compounding the hardship faced by rural communities and causing massive food production challenges, endangering the right to lead an adequate life and standard of living. Mr. Chair, when it comes to the impacts of war on food security, I have three very significant concerns regarding food production and food systems in Ukraine. The first is that remnants of war, landmines, and exploded ordnance seriously constrain farming activities in frontline communities, leaving many farmers unable to sustain themselves and unable to support their communities. That is a micro food system crisis we're already facing. Secondly, from the northeast to the southeast, the crescent in which the front line exists, this was the wheat growing area of Ukraine. And this is a country that was able to export $5 billion of wheat to the world in 2021, equivalent to almost 20 million tons. Ukraine was incredibly important in terms of food production for the world. But this crescent, as well as countless countries depending on Ukrainian imports, suffers the great impact of the war. That's a macro food system crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, the targeted missile strikes on food infrastructure across this country are most likely to continue through this winter, but have created long-lasting harm both for domestic and global food security. Mr. Chair, the World Food Programme is unwavering in our commitment to the Ukrainian population, especially as this winter looms. Despite the challenges from the ongoing conflict, we've adapted swiftly to meet evolving needs. To date, from the outset of this war, with Canadian help, we have distributed the equivalent of 2.3 billion meals to more than 10 million people. And 85% of everybody we support lives within the frontline areas. WFP continues to rely on the generous support of Canada and other members of the donor community that work with us alongside the government of Ukraine and other humanitarian partners, providing humanitarian relief and support to millions of Ukrainian families across the country. Mr. Chair, I will stop now as time is ticking, but I'm happy to answer questions about the food systems crisis inside and globally related to this war and the impact of the full-scale invasion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hollingworth. We next go to Mr. Harvey from the Canadian Agri-Trade Alliance. Welcome, Mr. Harvey. You have 5 minutes.
Bonjour et merci aux membres du comité de m'avoir.
Hello, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me here today. CAFTA is a coalition of national organizations that advocate for a free and fair international trade environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector. CAFTA's members include farmers, ranchers, processors, growers, and exporters in key trade sectors such as beef, pork, grains, oilseeds, sugar, pulses, and soybeans.
80% of Canadian farmers, producers, processors, and agri-food exporters that rely on access to global markets. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has, of course, had very negative effects on global agricultural markets, global food security, and nutrition. My knowledge of the dynamics of the war and its regional effects come only from reading the media, so I'm not qualified to comment on these. However, I would like to underline a few points that the war has brought home from the perspective of Canada's producers. The first point is that interrupting the free flow of agricultural products leads to worse nutritional outcomes for the world's poor. Trade is not just about farmers and people employed along the food supply chain. Trade also contributes to reducing food insecurity across the globe, including by buffering the impact of shocks such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Trade serves as the bridge to get food from where it is grown to where it is needed. In doing so, trade enables food security while creating economic opportunities for producers, farmers, and SMEs. Trade is also a key factor in the sustainable and efficient use of scarce global resources. My second point is that the conflict has significantly undermined the global rules-based order, creating greater uncertainty for Canadian producers. This is difficult for middle powers like Canada that have depended on this rules-based order. CAFTA believes that Canada must continue to work to reinforce the multilateral trading system to keep markets open as much as possible, thereby limiting the knock-on effects of shocks such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Le dernier point que je voudrais souligner est que nous ne devrions pas.
The final point I'd like to make is that we shouldn't respond to global uncertainty by retreating into a shell and limiting our economic relationships to like-minded countries. The best way to achieve economic resilience in Canada is to open markets, not close them. For example, the Canadian Agri-Food Alliance strongly supports the Government of Canada's efforts to break into the growing markets of the Indo-Pacific region, notably through the opening of the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in Manila. I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. We now go to the Canadian canola growers. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to provide comments on this important study. I will share my time with my colleague, Dave Carey. CCGA represents Canada's 43,000 canola farmers on issues that impact their farm success. As the world's largest exporter of canola, Canada exports 90% of what we grow as seed, oil, or meal, valued at $14.4 billion in 2022. International trade underpins the canola sector's $29.9 billion annual economic contribution and over 200,000 jobs nationally. Canola and its products are sold to 50 different countries. Ukraine is also a major producer and exporter of oilseeds globally, focused on sunflower seed and, to a lesser extent, canola. Known in Europe and the Black Sea region as oilseed rape, Ukraine production is relatively small in the larger oilseed complex. On average, it exports 3 million metric tons, largely destined to the European Union. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine created significant uncertainty in global grain and oilseed markets and widespread concerns with food security. At a time when the world was already reeling from the global pandemic, high food and input prices, and widespread supply chain disruptions. The conflict highlighted the importance of 1, trade to global food security, 2, for supply chains to nimbly pivot between markets as demand shifts, sometimes overnight and in unexpected ways, and 3, of strong trade corridors to move product to market. Trade provides food for 1 in 6 people globally, ensuring that food and other essential goods, such as fertilizer and crop inputs, get to where they are needed in a timely, reliable fashion. According to the World Trade Organization report, 1 Year of War in Ukraine, trade is a critical means for adaptation to crises. Trade between the affected countries has remained resilient. Alternative suppliers stepped in to cover the gaps, and with the United Nations brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative, of which Russia has since terminated, the war's impact on food security was dampened. That said, the potential impact on global food security remains fragile and tenuous and should be closely monitored. Over to you, Dave.
The war highlights the importance of strengthening our multilateral trading system to ensure it remains relevant in our increasingly unpredictable world, and of further breaking down barriers to trade. For example, the WTO underpins our global trading system, providing rules of engagement, mechanisms to ensure transparency between member states, and a forum to ensure trade corridors remain open. The canola sector relies on these clear, predictable rules, as well as those provided by Canada's suite of free trade agreements, to manage our risk and uncertainty when selling abroad. In recent years, we've witnessed an alarming move away from multilateralism and are concerned with an increasing trend towards national, sometimes protectionist approaches. World leaders are meeting this February for the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference with the goal to further operationalize reform, reinstate the dispute settlement function in 2024, and to deliver meaningful outcomes for agriculture and food security and other areas. An ambitious outcome would send a message globally that WTO members are committed to strong, inclusive, multilateral trade. Today, the canola sector faces a range of market access issues that limit our ability to seamlessly pivot between markets. Differences in sanitary and phytosanitary measures, food safety requirements, and approaches to modern agriculture create significant barriers when looking to shift trade flows. More emphasis on trade facilitative approaches and recognition of international standards would ensure more efficient movement of agriculture and food products. The importance of open markets equally applies to the inputs required to grow food. In March 2022, Canada imposed a series of trade restrictions on Russia, withdrawing the most favored nation status and imposing a 35% tariff on fertilizer imports. Russia is a key exporter of fertilizer, an essential building block to achieving plant yields and to sustainable production. Multi-country trade restrictions impede the movement of fertilizer globally, including to Ontario and Quebec, and the Canadian tariff increased Canadian farmers' costs by an estimated $34 million as of November 2022. Canada remains the only G7 country to retain a farmer tariff on Russian fertilizer. In conclusion, I'd like to stress the importance of strong Canadian trade corridors. Since the invasion, Canada has witnessed labour strikes that have impacted the movement of grains and oilseeds at both our western and eastern ports, and has complicated our ability to supply global markets. In addition to port capacity, Canada needs an effective and responsive rail transportation system to provide grains and oilseeds globally in an efficient and competitive manner. For prairie farmers, grain travels an average of 1,500 kilometers by rail to reach port position. Disruptions can significantly increase farmers' costs, constrain deliveries, and hinder Canada's reputation as a reliable supplier. Thank you for the invitation. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. We will now go to the members for questions. For the first round, every member has 5 minutes, and we start off with MP Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. The war in Ukraine, the illegal invasion, has interrupted what's been obvious has been the food trade, and has also been obvious in the energy trade, in particular into Europe. And we were exploring at this committee how Canada can respond. But that link perhaps isn't quite as obvious, and I'm going to build upon Mr. Carey's comment of an essential building block of food is fertilizer. Well, actually, what an essential building block of fertilizer is natural gas. 50% of the world's production is dependent upon access and conversion of natural gas. So I'm going to start with Mr. Hollingworth. Would you agree, and we've had previous testimony around that, essential to your work is access of natural gas to synthetic fertilizers so that we can feed the world collectively.
He's mute.
Is he muted? Mr. Chair.
Hello, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair. Certainly, fertilizer availability in the world has the unavailability of fertilizer in the world stands at the worst levels since pre-pandemic. We know the price indexes are now 98% above the pre-pandemic level for fertilizer, according to the IMF. It's very clear that without access to fertilizer, the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world that rely upon it to eke out sufficient food to cover parts of their sustainability are worst affected. And we know that from the IMF, the estimated additional costs to import bills for some 48 countries in the world most affected by food shocks are almost $9 billion additionally today from the pre-February 2022 invasion times. Conflict, economic shocks, climate extremes, and elevated fertilizer prices have an impact on global food insecurity. And of course, today we see a situation where 345 million people in 79 countries face acute food insecurity. So a fertilizer crisis is
my time is
food
limited.
insecurity.
Thank you. I'm going to add to that. I'm going to look for a little bit more of the Canadian perspective here on Canada's policy, given the change in the status with Ukraine. So Canada has announced targets for fertilizer emissions. We, my own farm, I've shared with this committee before that we've used more Belarusian potash and more Russian urea on our farms, and yet as a country, we don't have the infrastructure in place. Can you comment on the consistency of our policy on fertilizer and the calls from the world to produce more food? Are we being consistent? And have you seen yet a shift in Canadian position to actually answer the calls, given what, as a country, what we can do? Starting with Mr. Carey, please.
Yes, thanks for the question. No, absolutely. So for canola, for example, nitrogen is the second most important input after moisture. If we do not have nitrogen, we cannot grow a canola crop. And canola is for heart healthy cooking oil. It figures prominently in biofuels, et cetera, and meal, particularly for animal feed. So yeah, as a country, we have not made significant investments in our infrastructure going back to the 1970s. Really, if you look at whether it's electrification, the fact that, as you noted, that if you're in Eastern Canada, you're filling up gasoline in your car, it's probably from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia and not from Alberta. The same issues are certainly true with natural gas, propane, and then you get into fertilizer, where for Western Canada, where our farms are mostly supplied by Western production, huge potash in Saskatchewan. However, because of our own infrastructure, it's actually too expensive to move products from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. It's actually cheaper to import urea, nitrogen, other products from abroad, whether it's Morocco, Belarus, Russia. So certainly Canada is a country very fortunate production-wise, and I think we have an economic imperative to get our products abroad.
Also a chance to comment, and is this war teaching us anything? Mr. Harvey.
Sure. I mean, Mr. Carey gave quite a bit of information there. I'd just add from a broad perspective that often when Canada wants to play an important role in the world, the things that hold us back are things that we do in Canada. So I think it's very important for us to play this role of exporting our food, of exporting our natural resources to contribute to global peace and security. We have to work on the things that hold us back inside Canada and prevent us from playing that global role.
Thank you. Back to the canola. Ukraine was a significant exporter of sunflower. And now, what is the interchangeability of canola and sunflower? Is specifically the canola industry seeing an impact specifically on your canola exports because of the Russian invasion?
Yeah, our exports, we haven't noticed a huge, like Canada is a global leader, so we export about 60% of the world's canola. Sunflower is certainly part of the broader oilseed complex. Ukrainian production of sunflower is far less than Canadian production. Australia is our biggest competitor. But as my colleague Gail alluded to in her opening comments, the concern is it's very difficult to pivot and do quick transfers, because even in times of crisis, exporting a commodity into a country, if we don't have the proper sanitary or phytosanitary, we still can't move it. So it does speak to the global insecurity that we're facing, and the inability of us to position more quickly means that markets that go without, that require our products.
Thank you. We next go to MP Damoff. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I wanted to talk about trade with Ukraine. As you probably know, there's a modernized Canada-UK trade agreement currently trying to get its way through the House. I'm going to start with the canola growers. Do you export canola oil, canola to Ukraine?
No, not to our knowledge.
So where do your exports go?
So we export to about 50 markets around the world, largely to the United States, China, the European Union to be used for biofuel as well, in Mexico and Japan. Okay.
And then to all the witnesses, I'm just wondering if you have any comments on if you see benefit from this agreement. It does eliminate the majority of Ukrainian tariffs on agri-food products. So I'm just wondering, I'll start with you, but I'd like to hear from all the witnesses on if you see that this would benefit your trade between our countries.
Yeah, we're supportive of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. They are competitive with us globally. However, we know we've got a huge diaspora of Ukrainians, and a lot of Western Canadian farmers are from Ukrainian descent. So we're sort of agnostic on the benefits for our sector, but we're very supportive of Ukraine as a nation, and modernizing a free trade agreement is something that also helps uphold rules-based trade. So supportive but agnostic as a commodity.
Mr. Harvey?
Yeah, I'd speak along similar lines. Our members, which include the canola growers, it's not that there's a deep economic interest. It's more a question of solidarity with Ukraine at a time when Canada should be showing it.
And then, Mr. Hollingworth, do you have anything on that at all?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's critical for Ukraine to maintain and have sustained market demand for the products that it grows across the world, so including Canada. Ukraine is suffering because the Black Sea Initiative has been halted by the Russian Federation as of July. It's suffering because the way its supply chains were always built, it was built to export through the Black Sea to the rest of the world. Right now, solidarity lanes into the European Union have an increased price for everything that departs this country. So what can be shipped through the Black Sea is more competitive, and they desperately need the market, because without a market, and frankly, the market has suffered through this war and continues to suffer, there are poorer incentives for Ukrainian farmers to continue to farm. And that might not be this year's problem, but it will be a problem in years to come, and it will reduce the availability of crops in the global market. And as we heard earlier, if there are shocks, if there are issues, without Ukrainian grain, Ukrainian oilseed getting into the global market, you lose a potential level of resilience that the world always needs and needs today.
Thank you. I know, speaking to a woman I know who owns a popcorn company called Comeback Snacks, the lack of sunflower oil caused tremendous issues for her because you make popcorn with sunflower oil. And then she told me farmers in the U.S. had switched from corn to sunflower to try and meet the market demand for sunflower oil. And so as a result, she was having trouble getting both products and was going to have to increase the price of her product. So I'm wondering if any of you could talk about the impact this has had on inflation here in Canada with what's going on. Mr. Carey?
Yeah, I think the 2023 was likely the most expensive crop year ever planted for Canadian farmers. The price of inputs, whether that is fertilizer, whether that's seed, crop protection products, has never been higher. So we're certainly seeing farmers pinch in a way they haven't. Recent report suggested it's the largest sort of fall in on-farm. The gap between on-farm income and on-farm costs is the biggest decline we've seen, about 21%, which is the biggest since 1974. So farmers are resilient, and I think it's actually incredible the resilience of Ukrainian farmers that they're actually still getting a crop off the ground, because we've heard of mining in fields. Again, with the deterioration and Russia pulling out of the agreement, it's incredible that they've still managed to get a crop in and a crop off the ground. But we're all feeling that global pinch on commodity prices, and the ability also for farmers to change what they're growing is difficult. Farmers typically in Canada, for example, have to have decided this month what they're growing next year. So next year, if something happens catastrophic, you've already made all your input purchases.
Thank you. I think that's my time.
Yes. Thank you. So next we go to MP Bergeron. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today in order to inform us on what's continuing to happen in the Ukraine. My first question would be for our witnesses who are here in person. We've imposed a sanctions regime that ultimately is destined to make things more difficult for Russians. However, some measures were implemented and have been counterproductive. I'm thinking of the 35% tax on fertilizer that has as an effect to make Canadian products less competitive than Russian products on the international markets. And the Canadian government had recognized this fact. It's the only G7 country to have imposed a 35% tax on fertilizer. So the Canadian government in the last budget said that they would allocate $34.1 million as of 2023-2024 to help producers that count on Russian fertilizer. So I'd like to hear your position on this tax, and will you begin to see any of this money in terms of compensation from the federal government?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's our understanding that there's a mechanism in place now to return the money, but it's also understanding that none of that money has yet been returned. There's just been a commitment to make that return. We certainly wouldn't want to speak to how the government does diplomacy with Russia, but taxing our own farmers for Russian fertilizer, many of which were already purchased before the conflict began, seems counterintuitive because it makes Ontario and Quebec in particular agriculture production much more expensive. Farm groups from those regions asked for that money to be returned directly. The federal government indicated there's no mechanism to return it directly, so they'll return it via programming, which farmers can then apply for. So it has taken about $35 million out of the hands of Ontario and Quebec farmers, and it's done nothing. They still purchase that fertilizer, just at a loss of income.
Monsieur Harvey, souhaitez-vous ajouter quelque chose?
Rien ajouter.
Mon autre question.
My next question would be for Mr. Hollingworth from the World Food Programme. We know that countries such as Hungary, Slovakia, and even Poland are blocking the access to Russian grains to protect their own farmers. It's a perfect storm when it's no longer possible to export grain through the Black Sea to help developing countries, and it now becomes more difficult to export grain by land. What measures are being looked at to ensure that developing countries will be provided grain, given that 57% of the food grain exported by Ukraine is destined for developing countries? So what will be done to correct this situation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said earlier, markets for Ukrainian food production is critical, and it's critical that we find ways to get food from Ukraine that is produced by incredibly resilient farmers to the developing world, to countries that depend upon it and need it. The bans that have been put in place to protect farmers in 5 countries next door to Ukraine is with regards to protecting them against a cheap produce from a war-torn nation. Those countries have taken those decisions. However, our focus is getting Ukrainian food not to those countries, but to countries in the global south that need it the most. When the Black Sea Initiative was still functioning, through a period of not quite a year, we managed to push 725,000 tons of Ukrainian food to southern countries in the global south that desperately needed it. But very importantly, food got to the global marketplace. It got to countries well beyond those in the neighborhood. Solidarity lanes have continued to allow grain and other non-cereals to be exported from this country, including oilseed, to the tune of almost 60 million tons. It is still possible to get food from this country to the rest of the world. It is still possible to use Black Sea ports, albeit through neighboring countries like Romania. And so even though we've seen a stop on domestic purchases by the neighbors, there is still other opportunities available. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We next go to MP McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. This is very important. Mr. Hollingworth, I'm going to start with you if I could. We know that Canada has invested in humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And part of that has been around supports for food production and food storage. What more could Canada be doing? What more can Canada do at this point with regards to financial support in the food sector?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier in your previous discussions with Her Excellency, the Ambassador, you noted the issue of mine action in this country and Canada's specific interest, past and current, in that area of work. As I noted, there is a significant region of this country from northeast to southeast, the wheat growing breadbasket of the nation, but also in many of those areas, the vegetable growing breadbasket of the nation as well, desperately affected by issues of ordnance, unexploded ordnance, mines, etc. This is a country where it is stated that there's 174,000 square kilometers of land, even larger than that, which are affected by mines and UXO, of which 25,000 square kilometers is potential agricultural land. The need for every actor in the world that has a mine action component, a mine action speciality, to come together to support households from rural producing households, who, by the way, are the mainstay of growing vegetables and fruit in this country. 85% of vegetables, 83% of fruits and berries grown by small allotments, babushkas who sell their wares at the end of their road. Incredibly important for domestic food security. And that massive wheat belt, that belt that fed, that sent $5 billion worth of just wheat out of this country before the invasion in 2021. These are the regions that we need to focus on. We need to focus on non-technical survey. We need to focus on the cancellation of land from the perception of contamination, and we need to help farmers get back to farming in those areas, particularly in areas that have been, as it were, liberated. If there is no reason for people to stay because they can't make a living, they can't make a livelihood, why did people fight to keep to have them liberated? And so that's a key area for Canada to support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh. Do we have a point of order?
Yep.
Yes,
I'll
Mr.
just stop my
Bergeron.
time, but
Monsieur le Président, il semble y avoir...
There seemed to be an issue with the interpretation.
I was just advised of that just prior to that point of order. Mr. Hollingworth, I'm afraid we're having the same challenges we previously had. So going forward, the interpreters have advised that we can't hear from you anymore. But obviously, if questions are posed by the members, please do take the liberty of writing us and providing responses. But again, our apologies because of the connectivity challenges we had last time as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, it's up and down. It's fluctuating. Yeah, we'll just ask him to send it in because the same thing's going to happen. So terribly sorry about that, Mr. Hollingworth. So also I wanted to, yes, you will get your few minutes back. Madam McPherson, I also wanted to advise everyone that there could very well be bells going off for voting. I've had an opportunity to speak to everyone, and everyone seems fine with wrapping our session up approximately 10 minutes prior. So wanted to share that with everyone. Madam McPherson, you still have 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Hollingworth, I will still, is he still with us? I will still put questions to him. I know that you are not able to respond. I'm very sorry about that. I'm very interested in some of your perspective on this, so I would really appreciate it if you would write to us. The next question I had for you, knowing that Canada can and should be contributing to the rebuilding, to humanitarian assistance for Ukraine, my concern is that if that money comes from our ODA bucket instead of a separate fund, as we used in, for example, in Syria, that will take away from the contributions that we need to be making for development around the world. And I have some serious concerns about all of the resources going towards Ukraine at a time where we absolutely should be supporting Ukraine, but we can't ignore that there are other issues around the world. That's one question for you I'd like your perspective on. And then the final question I wanted to get your perspective on is, you talked about hunger as a weapon of war and how Russia is using hunger as a weapon by targeting the specific food infrastructure that is in place. Now, we know that the conflict in the Middle East has resulted in the people of Gaza not having access to food. In fact, the head of the World Food Program recently said parents in Gaza do not know whether they can feed their children today and whether they will even survive to see tomorrow. So I would love some insight from you on the use of hunger as a weapon of war and whether you think that is occurring currently in Gaza. And finally, if you could talk about, as we see the conflict in the Middle East, we know that, for example, Lebanon was one of the countries that needed the resources, needed the food from Ukraine. We saw that very early on that people in Lebanon were struggling as this conflict could, potentially spread, into Lebanon. What are the risks there, and how do we mitigate them in any possible way? I'm deeply worried about the people of Lebanon feeling the double impact of a conflict that is spilling into their region and food insecurity getting much, much worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to second round, and for second round, we're left with 3 minutes each. We start off with Mr. Abeltaif.
Yeah, thank you. I would like also for Mr. Hollingworth to continue to send me an answer. I have a question for the group, but I'm just wanna, for the sake of time, there's a say where policy can do, or what policy can do, money cannot. This is something that we find ourselves in those crises we're facing, especially the Russian-Ukrainian war, that if we're looking at the policies and what have resulted so far, they should have probably been a second thought on what we could have done better to get better results out of the situation we're in. So for Mr. Hollingworth, if you don't mind, you can email me on, or email us on the answer on this. And the same question goes to the panel we have here, maybe to Mr. Carey and Mr. Harvey, if they would like to weigh on it, would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, policy often goes further than dollars. The dollars do. I think we look at our country, the issues we have in Canada. They seem, sometimes silly relative to the issues we're hearing about today with the Middle East. And Canada needs to do a number of things. One is we need to modernize our infrastructure so we can move our products from where it's produced to get to export position to market. The strikes at the Port of Vancouver, the strikes at the St. Lawrence Seaway cannot happen if we want Canada to have an economic and moral imperative to move where we have an excess of agriculture and agri-food products to countries that have a deficit. Like, those things need to happen. We need Canada to be viewed as a country where companies want to invest in, like, commercialize their products of innovation. Agriculture is about innovation, just like telecom, just like IT, et cetera. We need to reduce some of our regulatory red tape so that companies see a path to commercialization in Canada. They understand the ROI, the R&D, and the regulatory burden. We need to make sure our farmers have the tools they need to produce agriculture products. We plant about 150 million acres of field crops every year in Canada. We have an economic and moral imperative to get that to the world. But we need to work across departments. We can't have silos. We can't have one department looking at a reduction in nitrogen and another department talking about a rail review. We're not on the same page as a country holistically. And we have the ability, the province of Saskatchewan alone produces enough food every harvest to feed Canada for a year. I think that speaks volumes about the ability, and agriculture is one of those sectors that we have not even come close to tapping the potential we have from an economic and a moral imperative, I think, to move our products from countries of excess to countries of deficiency.
And more in my area of expertise, I'd say Canada needs to invest a lot of effort in buttressing the global rules-based order. That's the case in trade. That's the case in peace and security. I think we're seeing a time of increasing uncertainty around the rules-based order, the jungle growing back, as the expression has been used, and Canada needs to work hard on that.
Food security and energy security. Do you believe that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing as far as the policy, that the approach, the overall approach into those crises that we've been dealing with?
I mean, that's a broad comment, but quite often we make mistakes in Canada that prevent us from playing as solid a role as we could abroad.
Thank you. Let's go to MP El Gabra. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Witnesses, thank you for being here. And Mr. Hollingworth, please feel free, if you want to contribute in writing to my question, to please submit your response. We're currently studying the issue of food insecurity due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. But certainly we're talking about public policies and what other issues that the federal government needs to be aware of and how we can contribute to alleviating those challenges. So to build on the previous question, what can you quantify the risk of climate change to food insecurity, and what kind of policies you think the federal government domestically and internationally needs to advocate in order to tackle that issue? Thank you.
That's a good question, a very broad one. I think there's give and take in any sort of policy like this. You know, we do know that Canada is about 1% of global agriculture, global emissions. Agriculture represents about 10% of Canada's emissions. However, our producers aren't producing widgets; they're growing food, feed, fuel. But farmers are on the front lines of climate change for sure. I would say that one of the things is, if you look at agriculture and farming as a climate solutions provider, canola, for example, is the best field crop at sequestering carbon because of its deep root system and the fact that it's grown on 20 million acres. So there's a lot that we can be doing as a country to look at what we call sustainable intensification, Mr. Chair, which is producing more food on the same amount of land using less inputs. So climate change is real. Farmers feel it. They're harvesting very wet conditions. However, there has to be give and take because they are producing food.
Clarify my question. This is not an attempt to play a partisan issue about where you stand on what the current debate here at home is. How risky is climate change to food security here at home and around the world?
Very risky, absolutely.
And that requires an urgent action by the world. And what can Canada do to lead, either domestically or internationally, to take leadership in that role?
For domestically, what Canada could do is make sure that our regulatory system is allowing, for example, gene-edited varieties of plants onto the market in a timely manner, because they have the ability to deal with using far less inputs, whether that's water, whether it's dealing with heat blooms. So looking, again, holistically looking at it is one way, but looking at our plants with novel trait system needs to be improved so that farmers get access to varieties that are more resilient. They can grow in different temperatures. Again, I could speak to that being in our wheelhouse would be making sure that our farmers have access to products that can deal with climate change, and that requires our regulatory system to be nimble and agile and all those sort of things.
You have time? No time.
Thank you. We next go to Mr. Bergeron. You have a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Hollingworth, and I'm not sure if the sound has improved or not. Perhaps we could try. You seem to indicate in your previous answer to my question that despite everything, you were able to make sure that grain would leave Ukraine. But according to your organization, over 345 million people were facing high levels of food insecurity in 2023, and at least 120,000 could suffer a famine in Somalia, Burkina Faso, and Somalia, as well as other developing nations. Is this not an indication that it's not sufficient what has been able to be exported, despite everything, through neighboring countries and the Black Sea, that this does not respond to the food needs on a global level?
Told not to talk, I think.
Worth, if you could kindly, hopefully you had an opportunity to hear Mr. Bergeron. If you could kindly respond via email, we'd be very, very grateful indeed. For the last minute and a half, we go to MP McPherson.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you all for being here. But I am going to ask Mr. Hollingworth. I know you can't respond, so I'm going to give you some more homework, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, some of the questions that I'd prepared were for you. So in your testimony, you talked about the fact that most small-scale farming in Ukraine is done by women and girls, or is done in a small has disproportionate impacts, I guess, on women and girls. And of course, as a country with a feminist international assistance policy, with a feminist foreign policy, that would be something that would be a key importance to us. And so if you could talk a little bit about that impact, the impact on women and why we should be thinking about that when we think about our commitments to food security. And then I also wanted to talk about the indexing of food prices with our with our development assistance. So we know that Canada was one of the first parties to ratify the Food Assistance Convention. We know that Canada has pledged to provide a minimum annual commitment of $250 million in food assistance, promising to help make delivery of food more efficient. Now, we heard from the Canada Food Grains Bank, Mr. Hagerman, who talked to us about the fact that it is important for an increased commitment to that. So from my perspective, it would be wonderful if you could talk about whether or not Canada should be indexing our food prices and whether or not it should be expected that we would increase that commitment. Thank you. Mr. Chair, that's all for me.
Thank you very, very much, Madam McPherson. So now we will adjourn in the next minute or so, it now being 12:49. So at this point, allow me to thank Mr. Harvey, Mr. Carey, Madam McLaughlin for being here in person, and also Mr. Hollingworth for joining us virtually. Again, terribly sorry about the challenges you experienced, but I understand you're in the same office you were last week when you connected with us, so perhaps this was foreseeable. But nonetheless, thank you very, very much for your expertise and your input. As soon as this report is ready, we will certainly make sure that we do send you a copy. Thank you. So if everyone's okay, we will just adjourn committee. Thank you.